That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G are specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441.
And welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly podcast of the Free Speech Union. And welcome back to our viewers and listeners. As you may have noticed, I am not Thomas Harris. I don't have the pecs for it. But Tom's on holiday. He's doing some kind of swimming training camp somewhere exotic. So I'm filling in, and I'm really delighted that it's given us a chance to have a new face on the podcast. One of my colleagues, Lynsey Metcalf, who is Case Management Officer at the FSU. Lynsey joined us back in December. She used to work in financial services in the city, amongst lots of other interesting things. But probably even more interestingly, she's finishing a doctorate in history at Cambridge University, which hopefully at some point will get you to actually talk about that. But today, what I want to pick Lynsey's brains on is that she's been doing some research for us, which I think will probably be published down the line as a briefing of some kind. She's been looking at the way in which free speech issues arise in education settings. And particularly today, what we're going to talk about is schools, because we haven't really talked about schools before. We very often come back round to talk about higher education. But today we're going to talk about schools. So, Lynsey, do you want to tell us a bit about what you've been doing?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jan. And I'm really excited to be here on my first podcast for the Free Speech Union. As you said, I joined the FSU back in December and quite quickly picked up some cases that were in the education sector. And I found I was starting to get quite a few cases with the same sort of issues coming through, especially parents were concerned, maybe a teacher had been sanctioned. So I went off and did a little bit of research and started this side project about what's actually happening in schools. And it quickly started to be called the Ideological Capture of Schools paper, essentially. And I've been looking at a few main areas. I mean, it's the typical stuff that you always get, gender ideology, critical race theory, religion, there's the checklist almost. But some really common themes were coming out with kids, and there's so much there. There's prevent referrals, there's non-crime hate incidents. And I think the thing that really struck me was the fear culture. And I feel really strongly that children should grow up happy and without anxiety and be able to ask questions. And even the kids themselves are really scared now to ask something, to raise a question in class, to maybe get something wrong. And children need to be able to make mistakes. So yeah, it's a huge piece of research at the moment. So it will get done alongside all my casework.
And so these kinds of, when you say that there's pressure on children and they experience this as something that kind of induces fear in them, where's that coming from? Is that coming from their peer group? Is that coming from staff?
It's a good question. I think a lot of it's coming from just the curriculum and the staff and the way things are. Obviously, this isn't all teachers, but the common themes that I'm seeing are very much a captured set of education staff pushing a particular agenda. And I spoke to a teacher about this. I've been interviewing quite a lot of teachers and parents, and actually some teenagers as well. But what's been really clear with the teachers is they genuinely think they're doing the right thing here. So they're stuck in that public sector, slightly left-wing echo chamber of actually the stuff we're doing is right. They genuinely feel they're building a better society, and that their job is not just to teach children facts and stuff. And as a historian, I'm very much about facts and reality and truth. But they feel that they should be pushing children in the right direction, in terms of right think. There's a good example actually of a young person I know. She was actually asked to do, it wasn't a case of ours, it's a separate issue, and she's given me permission to talk about it. She was asked to do the BLM salute at school. and felt really intimidated at the idea that she might say, oh, no, actually, I don't feel comfortable doing that. And it's the same with children being asked to use preferred pronouns, for example. They don't feel they can push back on that, because if they do, they get into trouble at school. And the thing with children is children don't really have free speech in the same way as we do. We know as a society we have to protect our kids from ideas or things that aren't age appropriate. So it's a totally different space. But I'm talking about, they can't even ask a question. They can't learn critical thinking. They're afraid to speak out in class. And we're getting teachers and schools referring children on to prevent, for example, for quite reasonable, lawful speech. And that's terrifying. Maybe mum and dad are a bit Brexity, seems to be the term that's come up in the last few weeks, or they've got a few right-wing books, or it's always usually in that sort of right-wing space. So yeah, it's a bit of a dark art as well, Jan. I'm trying to unpick what's really going on here.
So, as you said, children in the school context and, well, in wider society don't have free speech, which because they are under the authority of the adults around them. So therefore, it doesn't make any sense for them to have free speech. But nevertheless, we're teaching them how to develop the skills in order to have it.
Yeah.
So that's why it's so important that they're able to ask questions. Obviously, they don't get to speak at any time, any place when they're in the school context, because they're supposed to be, obeying their teachers. But that idea that they also have to obey the teacher's ideas, that's a whole other thing, isn't it? And so when there is ideological or political kind of teaching going on, is this happening because the curriculum itself is politicized, or is it is it happening in academic lessons, or is it happening in school assemblies and PSHSE, that kind of thing? Does it seem to be arising?
Well, I think that depends on the school. And I think that, we've seen a lot of talk in the press about decolonizing the curriculum. So let's say from a history perspective, there's certainly a particular agenda that is being pushed. And the idea of let's normalize certain ideas, even if we all know that they're not true, because that makes a better society. So, for example, stressing the number of Black people in the Middle Ages, or the Black Vikings came up this week as well. There was an article about that, or a whole module on Black Tudors, or the message that everything about colonization or the colonial empire background was bad. That's pushing a very particular viewpoint in the curriculum. But also it depends how it's taught. Teachers do have access to other resources, but and again, you've also got what's happening in the school itself. So, we had one case, which the person in question said, can you talk about this? But I will obviously keep it anonymous because this is a really sensitive environment. This person works in a school and was really concerned about particular books that were in the library. And when I talked about before about children being protected from ideas, I don't mean not being able to question. I mean not having access to, for example, sexually explicit material that's pushing a particular agenda, usually, gender ideology. And this particular person in the school just raised some concerns about that. They ended up on the back end of some disciplinary proceedings in the school because they were seen as disruptive. Unfortunately, we were able to help in the background and give some advice, and this person still has their job within the school, and it got resolved. But having seen some of the materials that are available to kids, they're totally age inappropriate, and you can't speak out. So a parent may come along and say, well, actually, I'd like to see what my kid is seeing. Tell me what's going on. And then the school clamp down, and it's all done under the guise of safeguarding. And obviously safeguarding is a really important thing, because we do have to safeguard young people from all sorts of horrible things. But it's being expanded really widely into this idea of, oh, no, it's a safeguarding issue if a parent raises a question. It's a safeguarding issue if the kid comes into school maybe talking about a few unpopular ideas, or it's a safeguarding issue if a teacher challenges the political agenda of the school. So, we're getting a system where you can't question anything and you can't get information. And for parents, that must be the most frustrating thing in the world. So you then see parents push back against it, and then the school clamp down. And maybe the next thing you find is mum and dad aren't allowed to go to the school premises anymore because they're seen as somehow risky. So everything is so risk averse. And we see it in, behavior in the playground, whatever. You can't climb onto a log in case you fall off it. But that translates to speech as well. You can't even have a thought that might be slightly risky because, oh no, we can't have that. So these kids are growing up not realizing that they can question things, they can have their own ideas, their own beliefs. I mean, Jan, is absolutely bonkers, frankly.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, well, having had two sons go through the education system a little bit before it was as bad as this, but you could see it coming. You could already see this closing down of questioning, and a couple of instances where each of my sons had experiences of being in a history lesson and asking a question in response to what was being taught. And I think in both cases it concerned race, and I think American civil rights and sort of American racism in the current period. And they were kind of piled on by the class, and the teacher didn't back them up. And so they're not going to do that more than once. And they weren't being racist. They were asking proper questions. So I think one of them was about, they were discussing cases in America, like the particular Trayvon Martin case, where a young teenager was murdered by a kind of community security guy, neighborhood watch type person I think it was in Florida. And yeah, terrible, terrible case. This was just a lad who was walking through a neighborhood, and because he was black, he
Oh,
was killed,
yeah,
and he was killed by a Hispanic man who'd taken it upon himself to police the community. And my son asked the question, which is not an unreasonable question: is why is it worse, or why do we think it's worse when a murder happens for racist reasons? And he wasn't saying this wasn't terrible, and
great
he
question.
wasn't saying it might be worse if it's racist, but he's saying, what's the basis on which we're making that distinction between this murder and that murder? And because he asked the question, he got a kind of pile-on from the class, and because all the other kids know what you're not supposed to ask.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing, isn't it? Is where, and in that circumstance, the teacher ought to absolutely side with the kid who's getting it in the neck from the rest of the class, and the teacher didn't. And then the other son at a different school had some similar one, very similar dynamics in a classroom. And I was so outraged. I didn't complain to the school. I tended never to get stuck in on behalf of my own kids. I just kind of didn't. I wasn't up for that sort of relationship
Oh,
with the
don't go
school,
there,
to be
Jan. No,
honest.
it's
But I can understand why parents do that. And the problem is, I think sometimes as a parent, once you get a bee in your bonnet about what you think is going on in education more broadly, you can really be primed to hear what your child tells you, and then you want to go into bat. And I think it's very difficult, because you don't want to become the parent who's continually having a go attacking the school, because the school has got shared responsibility for your child. I mean, they really do, legally, by the time they're in state education. Obviously, I think primarily parents obviously have all of the responsibility in all the meaningful ways, but nevertheless, teachers they are taking a lot of responsibility for your child. So you don't want to be at war with them. But I mean, what's your impression? Is it your impression that the parents are generally asking reasonable questions, and it's the way the school responds that makes things worse?
Yeah, I think so. I see a lot of weaponization of the idea of free speech, weirdly, within schools. So you might get a really minor incident, and let's say the kid raises a question in class, and kids are great at groupthink anyway. That's part of it. Kids want to fit in, so you do get those pile-ons. And yes, you're absolutely right. The teacher needs to come in and sort that out, and say, yeah, it's absolutely fine to ask those why questions. We really support that. And then if the teacher doesn't, it's established as this is the norm. But what might be a minor incident, I find then gets turned into a much bigger one. So obviously there's a lot of fear I'm not a parent, but I am a step parent of five, and you see lots of different sorts of behaviors. And basically, I think a parent might question something, the school pushes back, then all of a sudden the school get a little bit worried about what's happening at home. So maybe they contact social services, or maybe they think it warrants a prevent referral. Parents get angry about that. They're really worried. They're really concerned. They're pushed into maybe behavior which they wouldn't have had before. So they keep contacting the school, what's going on? And then it escalates and escalates. What might have been a minor question that should have just been dealt with in the safety of the classroom suddenly becomes this enormous safeguarding issue that needs to be dealt with. And, I think certainly when you've got official processes like prevent and these awful ghastly non-crime hate incidents, which frankly should never be being used again with children. It's totally inappropriate, not that they should be around anyway. All of a sudden you've got something on a kid's record and it becomes you're on a train. And what we're certainly seeing with the prevent referrals is the teachers are focusing massively on what they perceive as far right extremism. They're not focusing on what it was originally set up for, which was more looking at potential for radicalization with Islam, for example. I think teachers are terrified to go there, so they go for the easy pickings. And because they're stuck in this sort of echo chamber anyway, that you tend to get in the public sector, teachers just simply don't believe that these things aren't an issue. I think it's coming from an extension of hashtag Be Kind. This is the thing. I don't think these are necessarily bad people here with an evil agenda. They genuinely think they're doing the right thing by society. They think, we have to push this because this is the way we create a better world. And I think Tom mentioned that wonderful Ronald Reagan quote in the last podcast about if fascism comes, it will come through liberalism. I think was the quote, and it's exactly that. And I think you were going to speak about it today as well. There was the Andrew Doyle session at the weekend, and he, talking about his book, The End of Woke. It's all of the things that he's talking about in that, about this idea of, he talks about it as a cultural revolution. And I think the teachers feel they're part of this cultural revolution. So they have a moral imperative to push this one stream ideology because other ideas are dangerous.
I think even if I think there will be teachers who are very strongly activist, but I think they can be surrounded by people who are very just have a much weaker version of the same kind of consensus views, and so there's very few people who have a very different view, and then even fewer that actually support a different idea of education, which is that it is about genuinely critical thinking and knowledge and critical thinking, and that you need to educate children to be able to both master facts and then also to start to learn to interrogate the truth in a way that's suitable for children. I think that's the other thing at the moment is that nominally there's critical thinking all over the place, but actually it ends up just as a kind of very conformist critique of the world as it is. And or the way it's perceived to be in a particular kind of echo chamber of sort of mild left-leaningness, I suppose. And that to me that's very visible. You can see it all around the place. So I'm trying to think what came up. So you referred to the Andrew Doyle. We had an interview with Andrew Doyle last week, which the video is now up. It's already been watched by 6,500 people, I think, which is great. I know Andrew's got a lot of followers, and so have we. So, and he's all over the place doing lots of media work, which is great to promote his book, The End of Woke. He's very positive about that. Really, woke is now really on the slide, but nevertheless, that it's in education where it's going to be most difficult to try to change things, to reopen agendas. So what's your view based on what you've looked at so far on how that might have to happen?
I in a way, I think schools are almost going to be the last to go, because I think it's really hard for any adult to think we might have been damaging kids. So I think Helen Joyce talks about this actually in the gender space about, actually no parent of a trans child will ever admit that they've done something wrong. I think, we're always going to see that in education, that teachers are going to find it really, really hard to backtrack on some of this stuff. They're really doubling down because no one can bear to think that they're teaching something incorrect or damaging children. That children are a precious future resource, and most people want to protect kids and make sure they're okay. So I think that's going to be almost the last bastion of this stuff, because I just see schools doubling down a lot, and teachers increasingly getting into trouble, and parents increasingly getting into trouble as well. And obviously that does feed through into the university system as well. But I think universities are starting to change. Things are getting a little bit better. Again, I think you mentioned the Lewis Speaker Festival in the last podcast as well, where Matt Goodwin was talking about his book Bad Education. I was down at the Lewis Festival. It was really good to see him speak. And I think some of the things that he was talking about this sort of issues with free speech on campus, funding, polarized campuses. Yes, they're still there, but there's a lot of work being done. I think with schools, it's less polarized, more a protected echo chamber. And again, I'm not saying every school is like this. You've got some fantastic examples where it's not. But on the whole, what's coming out with the cases that we're seeing and the overall research is there is this doubling down. And I think we'll continue to see that for a while.
Mm. And what about some of the instances that you've come across where teachers have got into trouble? I mean, what kind of things have occurred in that area of the problem?
Okay, well, it is hard to talk about some of these because,
Mm.
these are teachers who could get their livelihoods are at stake. So let me talk generically about the kind of things we've seen. Usually it's someone raising what they see as a perfectly reasonable safeguarding issue. Why are we teaching this? Questioning materials coming from a particular space. Maybe it's they've got the gingerbread person or something, or we've got mermaids involved, Stonewall. It's easy to pick, by the way, on the gender ideology piece, just because that's the kind of the usually the most extreme, teaching these kids things that just simply aren't true. But so it usually starts quite mild with a teacher. Just questioning something, or maybe they've mentioned they vote reform, maybe they've got pro-Brexit views, and they're seen as, oh, don't want those mentioned to the kids. What happens if this person talks about that with children? And then we see this escalation. So it usually, as I say, starts off mild and then really, really starts to gather pace. And then before they know it, this person's been sanctioned for something they don't really understand why.
No, I can really, yeah. I think, there have been cases where teachers have lost their jobs because of what they've said, and sometimes, see, there's a few cases, not our cases, but stories, I suppose you'd call them, where I think teachers are probably not going about this in the right way. There's that chap in Ireland, isn't there?
Oh,
What's his name?
yeah,
Burke.
it's
And,
absolutely.
some other kind of stories that have been in the press where I feel like teachers, in a way, they're almost a mirror image where they're pursuing an agenda through the children. So they're kind of, even to the, there's obviously a lot to be debated and worked out about how you approach a child, or how you treat a child who, for example, has declared themselves to be the opposite sex. But I think that the onus on teachers really is to be extremely careful and compassionate about that, and not to be the one who calls out the child. I think it's so much more delicate than that, and I think sometimes there's a risk of people blunderbussing in because they think that it's their duty to be the last person to actually, hold the line with that child, and actually, again, it's this kind of balance, isn't it, between parents and school, teacher and child, where it's a very delicate thing. That the problem is it needs to be worked out in a very open and child-centered way, in a genuine sense
Yeah,
of being child-centered.
yeah, it's
But
exactly that, Jan. And I think, you mentioned the guy in Ireland, going about this the wrong way, in a way, even though the principles are quite interesting behind that. But I think we've got this idea of teachers seeing themselves as agents of social change and of social justice, and with these causes that have to be pushed forward at any rate. And if they don't, then somehow it's a safeguarding failure. So in pushing generally risk, I think this started with some sort of risk adverse behaviours with physical risk, not letting them climb the trees or whatever it might be, and then coming in with, well, actually, certain ideas are risky, certain ways of questioning are risky. Oh, actually, all good people think this stuff. All good people are, wanting to be, trans rights of trans women or women or whatever it might be, or critical race theory is the right way to go about things. So they're pushing these ideas, for social change. And the race point, I think, is fascinating, because we're then getting kids coming out with ideas that are really damaging. So we know, for example, that working class white boys are some of the most underperforming in schools, and yet those kids are now also coming out thinking that there's something wrong with them, that they're somehow bad, that they're ashamed, and that their black friends are somehow victims. And that's not to say that racism doesn't exist in schools and outside of schools, but they're being taught shame. And we shouldn't be teaching any kid to be ashamed of who they are, whatever it is, whether it's, sex, race, religion, whatever. So I think there's so much in this that I find, as a case manager as well, it's quite hard sometimes to unpick what's the free speech element and what's the sort of, in that social justice, what's in the safeguarding, and all of the curriculum, they all overlap. And in my research, my doctoral research, I mean, I'm a medievalist, so it's quite difficult to shoehorn quite a lot of this stuff into the Wars of the Roses, frankly. But I am involved in other organisations that are looking at things like, what does decolonisation actually mean? When we're talking about the medieval period, or let's get back to real proper history, or what are we teaching our kids. So it is quite difficult, I think, for us to unpick all of those ideas and see where we can really help, because it might not always be 100% a free speech issue, but there will always be elements. So it's a really complex area.
Yeah, and I know some of the issues that have arisen have been more like a freedom of information kind of issue. So there's issues down in Brighton in particular that I find out about from people, where parents have requested the school curriculum when it comes to sex education, those kind of areas, and they've been refused access to them for copyright reasons, because the bodies that are providing the materials say no, we can't release this material beyond the classroom on
Mhm.
that particular occasion. And that to me is outrageous,
Oh,
absolutely outrageous.
it's
I mean, it's
absolutely bonkers. I mean, one of the things that we're always interested in is information. What's really going on? Let's have a rational discussion here. Let's make reason-based decisions. And you mentioned the freedom of information requests, and yeah, often they just get denied. When we see it with the parents, though, as well, who want to find out what's happening, maybe about just generally about their child. So maybe they put in a request to the school, and it comes back so heavily redacted that it's meaningless, and withholding key information about your own child for a parent, that must be
mm,
so frustrating,
mm.
because you can't see what's happening. So yeah, there's a real information provision issue around this as well.
Yeah, and the terrible consequence of this is just the further undermining of trust.
Oh,
And trust is at the heart of, in order to have a kind of fairly organic relationship between school, parent, and child, you need there to be a really fundamental kind of trust going on. And when that becomes undermined because any party in that is treating another with suspicion, then it's just impossible. It's impossible, and you end up with either perpetual conflict or parents withdrawing their children from the school system altogether, which,
yes.
in some circumstances that may be right, but I think in a lot of circumstances, parents will be ill-equipped to educate their children at home. And if you're just withdrawing because you're fearful of what they're being taught, it's unlikely that you're really going to be able to help your child to flourish educationally speaking. Um, so yeah, it's something that's been arising since the very beginning of the Free Speech Union, and I know there are other groups in the same kind of space that are campaigning and finding out information about this. So, and our work sometimes crosses over with those. And as you say, it's trying to tease out when there's a free speech issue that we might get involved in, and when it's better dealt with by somebody else,
Yeah.
or when it's just a kind of issue that is a sort of societal issue of the current moment, that there isn't really a particular free speech angle. It's just a social conflict,
Yeah, it is, and I
which
think
there'll be more of.
oh, there's going to be so much more of that, Jan, and that's what I really love though about working in this space, is how do I unpick it and look at, where can we as the FSU really help, and where actually it might be best with another organisation. And you mentioned the children being withdrawn from the school system altogether. Absolutely, that is happening quite a lot. And also there was some interesting research out this week that showed that neurodiverse children, especially with autism and so on, they're disproportionately being referred to Prevent, for example. So there's a real misunderstanding and mishandling of how we deal with children that are maybe a little bit different, and maybe they ask those awkward questions. And there was always that kid in the class that stuck their hand up and miss, well, let's ask this question, and gets everything going. And you need that, but now we're clamping down on those children. We're suppressing it, and that's increasing conflict between children and parents as well. So you mentioned the conflict between parents and school and so on. They're taking that into the home. So if the child is being taught a particular agenda, they're thinking that's fact. Children are little sponges. They then go home and they have a row with mum and dad because mum and dad aren't thinking, good think anymore. So it's the whole situation is ripe for conflict. And I don't know what the answer is at the moment. Other than just, we've got to have these conversations. I think the fact that they're being really suppressed is a real issue at the moment. We've got to get out of this space where parents feel they can't raise a problem, where teachers feel that they may lose their job if they speak out. That's really dangerous.
Yeah, and I think the backdrop to this has been the slow expansion of what schools think is their business. So,
Absolutely, yes. Social
not
change.
just around kind of safeguarding, but also, going way back, things like healthy eating.
Yep.
So all these areas in which the kind of judgment of parents was being called into question, and parents were being seen as
Yeah.
being as much in need of education as the children, and that somehow schools were responsible for that. So I remember at my kids' primary school, there were sort of smoking cessation courses being offered to parents. There was just endless talk about healthy eating. That was before any of this kind of more woke sort of agenda came along,
Yeah, no,
really. But
I remember
that,
that.
and it breeds conflict because it's implicitly critical of what parents are doing, and it turns the school into this sort of a hub of social engineering, and then they actually lose sight of what they're there for, which is to educate children with knowledge.
Yeah, no, I think you're
And if they
absolutely
just
right.
did that,
Yeah.
that would be great.
It would be
That
so
would be
much
really
easier,
great.
let these kids come out of schools and go and have some discussions and learn for themselves. And, I was
Mm,
starting to smile because I remember the turkey Twizzlers or whatever it was, and the
mm.
parents poking hamburgers through the rails of the school when it was the
Yeah.
healthy eating campaigns. But it always comes back to this: teachers and schools as agents of social change. And the fact that we're seeing them talking to the police about non-crime hate incidents, which actually incidentally they should be dealing with that within the school and not referring to the police. Um, the fact that Prevent referrals are focusing on particular ideas, and it is what is the next thing they can do. And so there is this disconnect, and I guess we have to look at what they're being taught in teacher training colleges. What are the messages the teachers are getting there? So maybe this research will get expanded out into what's actually happening in the courses, but again, they're quite difficult to access what's really going on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's great that you're doing it, and it's something that, on the one hand, we've got this amazing resource of our kind of case data, and then all the kind of anecdotal or individual case stories as well to be told. Um, but also, it's really good that we're able to give you some time to actually go and explore that.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Well,
I'm sure I'm sure the cases side of things is incredibly busy, well, as I know.
the case
But
is, yes, it is incredibly
mm,
busy, but this kind of stuff is really important because, it was such an eye opener when I joined the case team that I think I spent the first couple of weeks just sort of standing up every so often going, wow, this, I knew it was bad, but this happens. This really happens. And especially when it comes to young people, and why I started looking into schools and education is, I've done a bit of teaching in schools. I'm not a teacher, but I've taught a bit of sort of A level, and I've taught at university as well. And, there are already some sort of red flags going off from my own experience anyway. So yeah, it's a real eye opener, but I think we could have another whole podcast on some of those.
I know. Well, it's funny because so whenever I'm at events or in-person events, people are always telling me, they'll say, "Oh, you guys are helping me. This person from the case team, I'm dealing with them, and it's brilliant," which is really, really nice. And I do always relay that on to the people who don't get to come to events because they're too busy doing
We've got
casework.
the cases now. We don't get to go.
No, but it is unbelievable people's stories. I mean, I people, because so many of them will never see the light of day. They're just dealt with, privately by us and with the person, um, and so they're never going to be like a big media splash. And I think if people knew, if they only knew,
Yeah, I
it's
think
just
that's exactly
extraordinary.
it. And one thing I would say is, especially with the stuff that involves children or young people, how absolutely heartbreaking they are. Some of these stories are. And one of my many jobs has been doing some work at, a mental health coach, and I just see this awful impact on, parents. I've seen children become estranged from their parents over free speech issues, or children
Mm,
being removed from the home, or weaponization of speech during divorce proceedings, or used in the family courts as a way of getting a parent away from the child. And they're just genuinely heartbreaking.
mm, mm. Yeah, well, hopefully, well, we look forward to that research being published. I'm sure it'll be up on our website when it's done.
When it's
And
done, yeah, absolutely. I need to get a bit more time to do this with all the
yeah,
cases that
well,
are
with
coming
that and
in
the
at the moment.
PhD, with that and the PhD, I'm sure you're really busy.
Ah, yes.
So I wanted to just mention the fact. So we've obviously thrown in a reference to the Andrew Doyle event last week, which was really good. And then I was able to take a signed copy of the book up to an event I did on
Ah,
Saturday with Women's Rights Network in Manchester, and they raffled it off, and they made a good few £100
great.
from their raffle. But we partnered up with Women's Rights Network Northwest Region
Mm,
because they wanted to put on an event on equality and free speech,
great.
and the speaker was Akua Reindorf
Oh, she's
KC.
absolutely amazing. Yeah, really great
Yeah, she was
speaker.
really, really good, and she was in conversation with Joe Bartosh, who's a journalist
Yeah.
who writes a lot for The Critic and Spiked, and has really made the sex and gender issue her own. Really, she's a real authority. So it's a great discussion with lots of very powerful free speech sections to it, which will kind of flag, I think, when we put the video up. But what was really striking was the level of expertise in the audience. So on this particular issue, normal people have really had to get up to speed on the law. So people are like, they're following every legal development. So obviously the event was going to happen anyway, and then the Supreme Court judgment came about, and people are really trying to make sense of what the truth is of the meaning of that judgment. And I find it extremely impressive how up to speed people are,
Yeah.
and people that have been campaigning on this issue have just they would sort of almost put it down in themselves, say, like, oh, well, I disappeared down the rabbit hole. And you think, well, thank goodness lots of people did, because
Yeah.
if they hadn't, I don't think this issue would have gone in the direction it now appears to be going in.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And certainly when I've been looking into the schools section, our members have been incredible. People have been wanting to talk, share information. It's been fantastic, and I can't thank them enough for the time that they've given me just to share some of their experiences. And as I say, some of them are really, distressing experiences. But what's come back as well is just the sheer weight of thank you, FSU, for what you've been doing as well, which is lovely to hear. Really, really good. So thank you,
Yeah.
everyone. If you're all out there, really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's always that is the big benefit of getting out and about, is you kind of get the thanks in person, which I then have to kind of radiate back to the teams.
Yes, it's always appreciated, Jan, when we get some thanks back. Much
Yeah,
appreciated.
well, I do try and
You do. You're
post in the
great,
chat,
actually.
give people credit, because I make a real point of saying I'm not on the case team. I don't do the legal work, so I can't take any credit. But thank you. but yeah, but some of the sort of free speech points that came up at the meeting were, well, to be honest, the initial context, which was, well, it's very nice to have a public meeting on this issue that isn't attacked. So this is the first time that Women's Rights Network Northwest had been able to have a meeting in public without, a whole hoo-ha of being chased out of, not literally chased out of venues, but no platforming. Sometimes they are actually, protested, under attack. And we met in a very lovely hotel. It was all very civilized. And obviously they're very good at working out their security in advance. And they kind of monitor to see if it's likely to come under attack, which is just outrageous. And they've had to become used to operating in that kind of way. Which again, I think people that haven't gone down that rabbit hole probably don't really realize just how extreme it's been for these women activists in particular, where they have to factor in, are there going to be people who invade our meeting and physically come for us, or who blockade the entrance, or who cause a load of trouble? I mean, at the LGB Alliance conference in the autumn last year, these kids came in and released,
was it cockroaches or something?
cockroaches
Yeah.
and locusts, and I don't know what they were, but they released them into the venue, which is a hugely costly thing, and you're not going to get back into a venue very readily
No, and it's
after
also
that. So
animal abuse. It's horrible. I mean, it's
well, I wasn't so bothered about that, to be
yes.
honest, but
Oh,
I don't have a great deal of compassion for a
well,
cockroach.
yeah, I mean,
But
it's just totally inappropriate on so many levels.
well, it's just,
And
it's
homophobic and
disgusting.
horrible. I mean, it's just, vile,
Yeah.
vile.
Yeah, so it was great to be able to partner up with an organisation to kind of, almost as a reward, we could give a really nice event in a lovely venue with everybody having a drink, and it's just really nice to be able to do that, because our events they've never been attacked. We've never had that kind of thing. And obviously you went to the Lewis
Yes.
festival, which had been threatened with attack, and that's what happened the previous year, where there was a kind of mini riot outside, which is why we got involved in making sure that they could go ahead by covering the cost of security this year. Just outrageous that these kind of things can
It's
can
absolutely
happen.
bonkers. I mean, the Lewis Festival, Speaker Festival, which I think you spoke about before, I was quite surprised going down there. The people outside actually didn't really, quite understand what they were protesting about, in a way. But it was so nice to see such a great talk where loads of members came, and Matt gave an excellent speech. We wasn't disrupted. We were able to get it all running very smoothly. So it was a real success. So I'm quite keen to get out about a little bit more and meet our members and see some of that direct impact. So all good.
Yeah. So, just being able to cultivate a culture of free speech out there in the world on any issue. I mean, to me, it wouldn't really matter what was being shut down. I think it's really important that we just try and make sure that things can go ahead where people are discussing important stuff.
Yes.
Okay, well, that was our first attempt at doing without Tom.
I think we did fine.
He did all right. He's probably chlorine soaked and wrinkly because
I
he's been
think
in the
so,
pool for a
but
week.
he's keeping very fit. He'll come back fit and well for the next one.
Yeah, bronzed Adonis.
Exactly.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Lynsey, for joining us. I no doubt you'll be back at some point, and thanks everybody for listening. Have a good week.